There are things you do in the dark that you assume the light will eventually erase. You tell yourself everyone bends a little bit to survive. You justify the promotion you stole, the confession you buried, the person you walked away from when they needed you most. You fold it up, shove it down, and pretend it never happened, until it shows up on your welcome mat. It's a plain black leather journal. No postmark, no return address, and when you crack the spine, you find your own name written in ink that hasn't quite dried yet. Page after page details every cruelty you thought you hid from the world, down to the exact hour you broke someone's life. And on the final page, your name is at the top. Underneath it is a date and a time. The diary never misses its target, and it never closes until the debt is paid in full. Marcus Vance liked to think of himself as a pragmatic man. In the cutthroat landscape of corporate real estate, sentimentality was a liability, and guilt was a wasted emotion. If you wanted to rise, someone else had to fall. It was simply the architecture of ambition. It was a Tuesday evening when Marcus returned to his secluded suburban home after closing a brutal acquisition deal that had systematically dismantled a smaller, competing family firm. The victory tasted sweet, laced with the intoxicating exhaust of absolute control. He stepped out of his luxury sedan, briefcase in hand, and noticed a small, flat package resting squarely in the center of his obsidian slate front steps. There was no brown paper wrapping, no shipping label, no barcode tracker from FedEx or UPS, just a heavy, unadorned black leather journal bound with a cracked leather thong. Marcus frowned, his analytical mind searching for a logical explanation. Had a courier dropped it? No. The gates at the end of his driveway required a security code, and the perimeter cameras should have logged a visitor. Yet his phone hadn't buzzed with a motion alert. He bent down, picking up the artifact. It was heavier than it looked, the leather supple and unnervingly warm to the touch, like skin that had recently been kept close to a body. Unlocking his front door, Marcus stepped into the sterile, minimalist expanse of his foyer. He tossed his briefcase onto the marble console table, poured a finger of aged single malt scotch, and carried the journal over to the leather armchair beneath the reading lamp. The book resisted when he pulled the thong loose. The sound was like a sharp intake of breath in an otherwise silent room. He flipped the cover open, expecting blank, cream-colored pages meant for sketching or journaling. Instead, the pages were densely packed with handwriting. It wasn't printed or typed. It was written in a cramped, jagged cursive that seemed to writhe slightly under the glare of the lamp. Marcus adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the first line. Marcus Vance, October 14th, 3 years ago. His breath hitched in his throat. October 14th was the exact date he had systematically fabricated financial discrepancies to force his former business partner, Julian, out of the firm, driving Julian to bankruptcy and public humiliation. Marcus hadn't thought about Julian in months. He certainly had never written the details down. Yet right there on page 1, in painstaking, agonizing accuracy, was the exact sequence of events. The falsified ledger, the forged signature on the buyout papers, and Julian's pale, shattered face as he walked out of the office building for the very last time. And then, at the bottom of the page, a sentence was scrawled in ink that shimmered wetly, catching the light as if it had been penned only seconds ago. The ledger does not forget what the mind refuses to carry. Marcus slammed the book shut, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. His hands were shaking. This was a sick joke, a malicious, targeted prank orchestrated by someone at the firm who hated him. But as he sat alone, in the quiet hum of his high-tech house, a cold, icy dread began to pool in his stomach. Because deep down, in the darkest, most locked-away compartment of his conscience, he knew one terrifying truth. No one else on earth knew the exact words he had said to Julian that day. Not a single soul. The whiskey glass felt heavy and useless in Marcus's hand. He sat in the dark for nearly an hour, his eyes fixed on the black leather journal resting innocently on the coffee table. The house felt different now, less like a fortress of success, and more like a cage waiting to be locked from the outside. Rationality fought a losing battle against raw, primal panic. He told himself it was a psychological break, a symptom of chronic stress from the merger. Yet the physical reality of the book remained undeniable. It occupied space in his world. Driven by a morbid, irresistible compulsion, Marcus stood up, walked across the room, and picked up the journal once more. His fingers trembled as he slid the cover open, flipping past the horrifying chronicle of Julian's ruin. Page 2. The handwriting shifted slightly, becoming sharper, more aggressive, as if penned by a different hand or under a different wave of fury. Elena Vance, June 22, 5 years ago. Marcus stumbled backward, his hip catching the edge of the mahogany sideboard. Elena, his younger sister. 5 years ago, Elena had inherited a substantial trust from their grandmother, money intended to fund her veterinary clinic. Marcus, drowning in high-stakes gambling debts at the time, had spent weeks manipulating her, convincing her that a high-risk venture fund he managed was a safer bet. She had handed over her entire inheritance. Within a month, the fund collapsed, wiping out every cent. Elena had lost her dream, her savings, and her trust in humanity, eventually moving across the country to work a low-wage job in a quiet rural town, completely broken. Marcus had never told a soul about his direct hand in the collapse of that fund. He had covered his tracks with shell companies and offshore accounts. He leaned closer to the page, his vision tunneling as he read the entry. She begged you to leave her enough to pay off her clinic lease. You looked her in the eyes, smiled, and told her the market is a harsh master. You bought a sports car the next week with her security deposit. A wave of intense nausea hit Marcus. The words weren't just describing the event, they were capturing his exact internal monologue, the cold, dismissive arrogance he had felt in that exact moment. He flipped frantically to the third page. David Miller, August 9, 8 years ago. David Miller, a college classmate whose thesis Marcus had stolen, passing it off as his own to secure a prestigious fellowship that launched his entire career. David had confronted him, threatened to expose the plagiarism, and Marcus had quietly ensured that David was expelled on a fabricated drug charge before he could speak to the faculty board. David had vanished from academia entirely, swallowed by obscurity. Page after page, name after name, Marcus flipped through the thick volume with frantic speed. It wasn't a diary of his life. It was a catalog of his quietest, most calculated atrocities. The sins he had buried so deeply, he had almost convinced himself they were virtues. And then, near the back of the book, the pages stopped being historical. They became current. Marcus's hand froze over a page near the end. The ink on this page was completely dry, dark, and permanent. At the top was a name he recognized instantly, his own, Marcus Vance. Below his name, written in the same meticulous, accusatory hand, was a detailed itinerary of his day tomorrow. Every meeting, every route he planned to take, every coffee shop he intended to visit. And right at the bottom, stamped in bold, unyielding strokes, was a single line: expiration date, tomorrow, 11:45 p.m. Marcus let out a ragged gasp, dropping the book as if it were burning hot. It hit the floor with a heavy thud. He backed away until his shoulders slammed against the kitchen wall. It wasn't a prank, it wasn't a psychological episode, it was an inventory, and his name was the next item scheduled to be checked off. By midnight, Marcus's pristine home had been transformed into an armed fortress. He had drawn every blackout curtain, double-bolted the heavy steel-reinforced doors, and armed the perimeter security system to its highest sensitivity setting. Yet safety felt like an illusion. He sat at his sleek glass dining table, his laptop open, frantically trying to research the journal. He searched for custom leather-bound books, ancient grimoires, supernatural contracts, anything that could explain how a physical object could materialize inside a locked perimeter with a history of his life written inside it. Nothing came up. The internet offered plenty of creepypastas and urban legends, but no answers. His eyes kept darting back to the living room, where the black leather journal lay face down on the rug where he had dropped it. He hadn't dared to pick it back up. The thought of touching it made his skin crawl, as if the ink were contagious. At 2:00 a.m., his phone buzzed on the table. Marcus jumped, his heart leaping into his throat. He stared at the screen. It was a text message from an unknown number. You forgot page 14. Marcus stared at the glowing letters, his breath catching. He hadn't read page 14. In his panic, he had only glanced at the first few pages and the horrifying final entry with his own name. Slowly, deliberately, driven by a morbid, terrifying curiosity that overrode his self-preservation instinct, Marcus stood up and walked into the living room. He knelt down on the hardwood floor, reached out with a trembling hand, and picked up the book. He flipped the pages with a nervous thumb, stopping when he reached number 14. The entry here wasn't about business, money, or stolen work. It was from when he was 19 years old. A college party, a rainy night, a terrified freshman girl who had trusted him to walk her back to her dorm, whom he had left stranded miles away in the dark woods behind the campus after a cruel prank gone wrong. She had wandered for hours in the freezing rain, developing severe pneumonia that permanently scarred her lungs. Marcus had never faced consequences for that night. The university hushed it up, and the girl transferred out of state, disappearing from his world entirely. Beneath the horrifyingly accurate description of that night, a new line of text had appeared, written in real time, right before his eyes. The ink was pooling and shifting slightly, as if it were still wet. She never forgot the sound of your car driving away. Tomorrow night you will walk those same woods, and the rain will finally start. Before Marcus could drop the book, a sharp metallic clink echoed from the front hallway. It wasn't the security alarm, it wasn't the sound of breaking glass. It was the distinct, unmistakable sound of the brass front door handle slowly turning downward, as if someone outside was trying a key they knew would fit. Marcus froze, every muscle in his body locking tight. The blood rushed in his ears like a roaring freight train, drowning out all other sound. Click. The heavy deadbolt, the one Marcus had personally thrown into place just hours earlier, slid backward on its own accord, moving with a smooth, oiled, mechanical precision that defied physics. He stood frozen in the center of the dark living room, the black leather journal clutched in his white-knuckled grip like a talisman. The front door creaked open, pivoting slowly on its hinges to reveal the pitch-black entryway. No silhouette stood on the porch. There was no shadowy figure lunging through the threshold with a weapon. Instead, a thick, unnaturally cold draft swept into the house, carrying the sharp, unmistakable scent of damp earth, rotting pine needles, and freezing autumn rain. Yet, when Marcus glanced toward the front window, the night outside was clear, dry, and starlit. The storm existed only inside his foyer. "Who's there?" Marcus called out, his voice cracking, betraying the terror he was desperately trying to swallow. "I have a gun. I've called the police." His words fell flat, swallowed instantly by the heavy, suffocating silence of the house. No footsteps answered him. No voice echoed back. Slowly, dragging his feet as if they were encased in lead, Marcus crept toward the foyer. The temperature dropped with every step he took, his breath pluming in white puffs before his face. When he reached the hallway, he stopped dead. Lying on the marble floor, exactly where his briefcase had been tossed earlier, was a single wet footprint. It was shaped like the print of an old, worn-out canvas sneaker, the exact kind of shoe a 19-year-old college student would wear on a rainy night in the woods. And directly beside the footprint, resting on the console table, was something new. It was a small, rusted iron key, attached to a faded green plastic lanyard. Marcus stared at the key, a wave of profound, soul-crushing vertigo washing over him. He knew that key. It was the key to the old campus dormitory storage locker from 8 years ago, the very locker where he had locked away the girl's belongings after abandoning her in the woods. He had thrown that key into a river on his way home that night. Yet here it was, resting on his clean marble table, dripping with dark, muddy water that was slowly pooling into a small puddle. As Marcus stared at the key, the black leather journal in his left hand began to vibrate. It wasn't a violent shaking, but a low, rhythmic thrumming, like a pulse beating beneath the dead skin of an animal. He looked down at the book. The pages were turning themselves, flipping backward and forward with a rapid, whispering rustle until they snapped to a dead stop right at the middle. A fresh line of text was burning itself onto the page in jagged, glowing strokes of crimson ink. "You cannot lock out what you invited in, Marcus. Every door you closed on someone else is now unlocked for you." Before he could react, the front door slammed shut with a concussive blast, that rattled the picture frames on the walls, plunging the foyer into absolute, impenetrable darkness. Marcus stumbled backward into the living room, gasping for breath, his fingers digging into the leather binding of the journal as if it were his only anchor to reality. He needed to escape. He needed to get to his car, drive to a police station, or get onto the interstate where there were lights, cameras, and people. He sprinted toward the garage door, fumbling in his pocket for his car keys. His fingers found them, but as he jammed the key fob into the deadbolt of the garage door and turned it, nothing happened. The electronic light on the keypad was completely dead. Panic clawing at his throat, Marcus slammed his shoulder against the door. It didn't budge. It felt as though it had been welded shut from the outside by tons of solid steel. He was trapped inside his own meticulously engineered sanctuary. Desperation driving him, he ran back to the living room to grab his cell phone from the dining table to call for help. He snatched the device off the glass surface and stared at the screen. No service, not even an emergency call signal. The screen was locked on a single, unchangeable notification image. A small, pixelated icon of an open black book, flashing rhythmically. Suddenly, the smart home speakers embedded in the ceiling, the automated system that controlled his lights, music, and security, flickered to life with a harsh, electric hum. Marcus froze, looking up at the ceiling vents. A voice began to speak through the speakers. It wasn't a synthesized robotic voice, and it wasn't a recording. It was a clear, crisp, terrifyingly familiar audio playback of his own voice, reciting things he had said in absolute privacy years ago. She'll find her way back to the dorm eventually. It's good for character building to walk in the dark a little bit. Marcus clapped his hands over his ears, squeezing his eyes shut. Stop it. Shut up, he screamed into the empty room. Julian's signature was so easy to forge. The speakers continued, looping through his past admissions of guilt with horrifying clarity. He's too weak to fight a corporate audit anyway. Let him drown. Elena is too trusting. If I don't take her money, someone else will. It's just business. The walls seemed to close in around him. The confessions echoed from every corner of the house, bouncing off the minimalist walls, turning his own arrogant words into a psychological torture chamber. The house was playing his sins back to him, stripping away every layer of rationalization and self-justification he had spent a lifetime building. He dropped to his knees on the rug, the journal clutched tightly to his chest. The book felt heavier now, not with physical weight, but with the suffocating mass of every human life he had casually damaged on his climb to the top. And then, as abruptly as it had started, the audio cut out. Silence rushed back into the room, expectant silence that felt worse than the noise. Slowly, Marcus lowered his hands and opened his eyes. The lights in the living room flickered off, leaving only the pale, eerie glow of the moon filtering through the high clerestory windows. Across the room, the television screen, which had been turned off, woke up on its own. There was no broadcast playing, just a live, high-definition security camera feed showing the dark, rain-soaked woods behind his old university campus, hundreds of miles away. And standing in the middle of the frame, illuminated by the pale moonlight, was a single figure in a soaked canvas jacket, staring directly into the camera lens. The television screen didn't just show the woods. It projected an atmospheric pressure that seemed to bleed out into Marcus's living room. The air grew bitingly cold, smelling intensely of wet pine needles, ozone, and wet earth. Marcus scrambled backward until his back hit the sofa, his eyes wide, locked onto the screen. The figure in the woods on the television didn't move. It stood completely still beneath the skeletal canopy of ancient oaks, its face obscured by the deep shadow of a hood. But Marcus knew, with a certainty that chilled his marrow, who was standing there and what she was waiting for. He looked down at the black leather journal in his lap. The cover was now slightly parted, and the pages were fluttering slowly, like the wings of a trapped moth, settling on a specific entry near the back. He didn't want to look. Every instinct screamed at him to throw the book into the fireplace, to run, to hide his head in the sand. But an invisible, irresistible current pulled his gaze downward. The page was blank, save for a single sentence written in stark, elegant script. The debt is called. Return to where you left her. As soon as his eyes registered the words, the front door of his house, the heavy steel door that had just slammed shut, swung wide open once more. Outside, there was no longer a suburban street, no manicured lawns, no neighbors' houses, just a dense, impenetrable wall of dark, towering pine trees, swaying silently in a freezing vertical rain. Marcus stared through the open doorway into the impossible threshold. The paved driveway had vanished, replaced by a muddy, leaf-strewn footpath, winding its way into the pitch-black heart of the forest. He was no longer in his home. His house had become a way station, a transitional threshold built out of the very architecture of his guilt. "No," Marcus whispered, his voice trembling violently. "I'm not going out there. It's just a trick. None of this is real." He forced himself to his feet, intending to run toward the back of the house, to lock himself in a bathroom, to fight the reality of what was happening. But the moment he tried to take a step backward, his legs refused to obey. His feet were locked in place, planted firmly on the hardwood floor, pivoting slowly, mechanically, until he was facing directly toward the open doorway and the dark, rainy woods beyond. His body was no longer entirely his own, it belonged to the ledger now. With jerky, automated movements, Marcus began to walk forward. He crossed the living room, stepped over the threshold of the front door, and walked out into the freezing, relentless downpour. The moment his shoes hit the muddy trail, the heavy front door behind him slammed shut with a final echoing crash and vanished entirely, leaving only a solid wall of ancient trees behind him. He was alone in the dark woods, and the walk back had begun. The rain was freezing, driving down in heavy, needle-sharp sheets that soaked through Marcus's designer suit within seconds. The mud sucked at the soles of his expensive leather shoes, making every step a grueling, ankle-deep struggle. In his right hand, he still carried the black leather journal. He had tried to drop it twice during the first 100 yards of the trek, letting go of the binding and watching it fall into the brush. But each time when his hand swung forward with his stride, the book was simply back in his grip, its cold leather surface pressing against his palm as if it were grafted to his skin. He was trapped inside the narrative he had tried so hard to escape. As he trudged deeper into the twisting, overgrown paths of the woods, the environment began to shift. The trees weren't just trees anymore, they were monuments to his past. Carved into the thick, mossy bark of the oaks as he passed them were names and dates, not natural scarring, but clean, deep incisions that looked like they had been written with a knife. Julian, October 14th. Elena, June 22nd. David, August 9th. Every betrayal, every shortcut, every ruined life he had left in his wake was catalogued along the trail, turning the dark forest into a physical museum of his moral decay. The wind howled through the canopy, carrying voices, whispers floating on the freezing air just out of earshot. He could hear Julian's voice, cold and disbelieving, reading out the forged financial statements that ruined him. He could hear Elena's voice, shaking with quiet betrayal as she handed over her grandmother's inheritance. "Stop it," Marcus panted, his breath coming in ragged, freezing gasps as he stumbled over an exposed root. "I did what I had to do. Everyone does it. That's how the world works." He shouted into the empty trees, desperate for a counter-argument, desperate to justify the ruthless ambition that had defined his entire existence. The forest answered with silence, followed immediately by the heavy, rhythmic crunch of footsteps, walking parallel to his path, just beyond the dense wall of ferns and briars. Something was pacing him. Marcus stopped walking, his heart hammering against his ribs like a sledgehammer. He turned his head frantically, trying to peer through the driving rain and the dense, twisting shadows. A few yards away, half hidden behind the trunk of a massive weeping birch, stood a figure. It was wearing a soaked canvas jacket, the hood pulled low over its face. In its hands it held something heavy, an old, rusted iron key swinging slowly back and forth on a faded green lanyard, ticking like a metronome against the silence of the woods. Marcus opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His throat felt dry and constricted, choked by the rising tide of absolute, unadulterated terror. The figure didn't charge. It simply turned and began walking deeper into the maze of trees, beckoning him forward toward the center of the dark. The path opened up abruptly into a wide, circular clearing, surrounded by towering, ancient pines that blotted out the stormy sky entirely. The ground here wasn't mud. It was a flat expanse of gray, compacted slate, glistening wet under the relentless rain. In the center of the clearing stood an old, weathered wooden table. Resting on top of it was a single, flickering tallow candle, casting a weak, amber circle of light against the encroaching dark. And sitting beside the candle was an empty chair, facing outward toward the perimeter of the trees. The figure in the canvas jacket walked straight to the table, stopped, and turned to face Marcus. Slowly, deliberately, the figure reached up and pulled back the hood. Marcus expected to see the face of the college freshman he had abandoned in the rain all those years ago. Older, hardened by trauma, seeking direct vengeance. But as the hood fell away, the breath evacuated Marcus's lungs in a violent, choking rush. There was no face beneath the hood. Where features should have been, there was only a smooth, pale expanse of aged parchment skin, covered from temple to chin in dense, microscopic handwriting. His own handwriting, chronicling every choice, every rationalization, every calculated cruelty of his entire life. The blank-faced entity lifted the black leather journal from Marcus's hand, the book sliding away from his grip with a soft, effortless tear of suction, and placed it gently on the wooden table beside the flickering candle. "Sit," a voice whispered. It wasn't a sound spoken through vocal cords, it was a chorus of voices. Julian, Elena, David, and dozens of others he had pushed aside, stepped over, and forgotten, resonating directly inside Marcus's own skull. Marcus's legs buckled, his knees hit the cold slate floor of the clearing, and he dragged himself forward until he collapsed into the wooden chair opposite the entity. "I built everything," Marcus choked out, tears mixing freely with the rainwater streaming down his face. "I worked for it. I earned my place." The entity reached out a pale, parchment-skinned hand and opened the leather journal to the final page, the page bearing Marcus's name and the expiration timestamp that was now only minutes away. "You built a ledger," the chorus of voices echoed in his mind, cold and absolute. "You recorded everyone else's debts, but you never balanced your own." The entity slid the journal across the table toward him. Resting directly on top of the final page was a heavy, old-fashioned fountain pen, filled with ink as dark as pitch. "Sign," the entity commanded. Marcus stared at the pen. He knew what the signature meant. It wasn't an agreement to change his ways. It was the final entry, the balancing of the scales, the moment where the account was settled in full, and the debt was paid back to the universe with interest. The candle flickered violently, casting long, twisting shadows across the clearing as the final seconds ticked away. The rain seemed to stop, suspended in midair like tiny glass beads frozen in time. The wind died down to an absolute suffocating stillness. Marcus Vance sat at the wooden table in the center of the dark forest clearing, his hand hovering over the heavy fountain pen. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to throw the pen away, to run, to fight for a single extra breath of life. But his muscles were completely paralyzed, held in place by an invisible, crushing weight of cosmic inevitability. He looked down at the open page of the journal. His name was written at the top in his own erratic, panicked handwriting. Beneath it, every single justification he had ever used to excuse his malice was laid bare, stripped of all pretense, ego, and lies. He saw himself clearly for the first time in his life, not as a pragmatic survivor or a brilliant strategist, but as a parasite who had fed on the trust and vulnerability of others to build a hollow monument to himself. "There has to be another way," Marcus whispered, his voice cracking, the arrogance entirely gone, replaced by a raw, pathetic plea for mercy. "I can fix it. I can give the money back. I can call Julian. I can rebuild what I broke." The parchment-faced entity sitting across from him didn't move. It simply watched with its blank, text-covered visage, the candlelight reflecting dully in the microscopic lines of ink. "The ledger cannot be rewritten once the final hour strikes," the chorus of voices echoed quietly inside his mind. "You wrote the rules of the climb, Marcus. You dictated that someone must always fall so another can rise. Now, the math is complete." With a final involuntary shudder, Marcus's fingers closed around the barrel of the fountain pen. His hand descended toward the page. He tried to pull back, to resist the motion, but his arm moved with the relentless, unyielding precision of a clock mechanism. The nib of the pen touched the heavy, cream-colored paper. He began to write his own name at the bottom of the ledger. As the black ink flowed from the nib, A strange sensation washed over him, not pain but a profound hollow lightness. It felt as though every memory, every ambition, every cruel calculation, and every stolen victory was being systematically drained out of his mind, leaving behind an empty, silent shell. With every stroke of the pen, the trees around the clearing began to fade, dissolving into gray mist. The wooden table grew translucent. The cold rain, once suspended in the air, began to fall upward, melting away into the heavy clouds above. As he crossed the final letter of his signature, the candle flickered once and went out. Absolute infinite darkness swallowed the clearing whole. And for the first time in his life, Marcus Vance made a sound that wasn't an argument, a justification, or a command. He simply disappeared into the quiet. The sun rose over the quiet, manicured suburbs, casting a warm, golden light across the obsidian slate front steps of Marcus Vance's secluded home. The house was perfectly silent. The doors were locked. The security system was green and operational, and the interior was pristine, orderly, and entirely empty. On the kitchen counter, Marcus's phone sat dark and silent, its screen locked on a black background. On the front steps, resting squarely in the center of the slate landing where the previous package had materialized, lay a brand new, unblemished black leather journal, bound with a tight leather thong. Across the street, an elderly neighbor walking his dog paused for a moment, frowning as he looked toward Marcus's silent house. He didn't remember seeing a package there when he walked by earlier, and he hadn't heard a delivery truck all morning. He shook his head, looked away, and continued down the sidewalk. A few moments later, the heavy front door of the neighboring house swung open, and a middle-aged man stepped out onto his porch, coffee mug in hand, grumbling about a business deal he was planning to sabotage later that afternoon. As he walked down his steps to grab the morning paper, his eyes caught the dark shape resting across the street on Marcus's porch. He paused, a strange, unexplainable curiosity tugging at the edge of his mind. He didn't know whose house it was, and he didn't know how the book had gotten there. But as he stared at the black leather binding, gleaming in the morning sun, he felt an irresistible, chilling pull drawing his feet toward the street. The ledger was open, and the ink was already waiting. If you made it to the end of the ledger, thank you for listening. We all like to think our private mistakes stay buried, that the compromises we make in the dark never follow us out into the light. But sometimes the things we try hardest to forget are just waiting for the right page to turn. If you enjoyed this descent, make sure to hit that subscribe button, ring the bell, and leave a comment below telling me what's the one memory you hope never shows up on your doorstep. This is Halfway Dark. Stay curious, keep the lights on, and I'll see you in the next dark corner.